Alright, how's it going everybody? Mr. Binder here. Let's talk about Chapter 10, the Endocrine System. Uh, in Chapter 9 we discussed homeostasis, a fine balance, basically how the body tries to maintain values within a tolerable range. And some of the examples we spoke about were thermoregulation and osmoregulation, so maintaining an internal temperature and also water balance. Well, the endocrine system also helps to maintain homeostasis. Uh, it's made up of a lot of different types of endocrine glands that secrete hormones. And what these hormones do is help to control organ and tissue function. So basically helping to maintain homeostasis. Again, some other contributing factors with these hormones, they help with growth and development, again, behavior, energy, metabolism, and some of the other examples that we talked about was thermoregulation and osmoregulation. Taking a look here, we see that there are a variety of different glands that are found in the endocrine system. Take a look at each of them. You will have to label the endocrine system or all the glands that are found in the endocrine system on one of your assignments. So please take a look at this page when doing that. But the main function of the endocrine system is to secrete hormones. Okay, and these hormones will travel the bloodstream and affect either other organs or tissues or cells. What are hormones? Again, we will talk about two different types of hormones, but more importantly, hormones are just produced and secreted by different types of cells, tissues, but most importantly, the endocrine system, so glands, endocrine glands. All right, and again, these hormones are circulated throughout the body. Only target cells with this will respond to a specific hormone. So again, taking a look at this picture here, we've got target cell A and we've got hormone A. Well, again, specific receptors on the cell membrane will identify that hormone A, and this cell will, obviously, there will be a response in that cell. Hormone B, taking a look here, we see hormone B, target cell for hormone B has those specific receptors. So again, hormone B will attach those receptors and send a signal inside. Hormone A will not affect target cell for hormone B, or this cell here. This will not be affected by hormone A because there aren't specific receptors that will bind to hormone A. Again, hormones are very specific and they each have their own target cells, target tissues, or organs. Hormones, again, when they're secreted into the bloodstream, they are in an inactive form, so they're known as prohormones. Prohormones, an inactive form of a hormone. And basically, when something's needed, or when a hormone is needed from the body, these prohormones will be converted by target cells or by enzymes in the bloodstream, okay, to an active form. So the example here is angiotensinogen. All right, angiotensinogen is the prohormone. Angiotensin is the active form of that hormone. And again, angiotensin has its own function in the body. It helps to increase, okay, blood pressure, all right, by the kidneys. And again, it's just an example of a prohormone, as well as when it's needed, it will be converted to its active form. Okay, here we have two different types of hormones, again, protein hormones and steroid hormones. We'll talk about each of these, specifically their characteristics, and then what we'll do is we'll talk about how they actually signal a cell. So protein hormones here, again, proteins are consisted of amino acids, about 3 to 200 in length, depending on the hormone. Proteins are usually hydrophilic, meaning that they're water soluble. Again, because of this property, they can diffuse well through the blood. The only thing that protein hormones cannot do is pass through the lipid membrane because of its characteristics. So again, when we talk about signaling a cell, protein hormones will attach to a receptor outside of the cell membrane. Steroid hormones, again, they're derived from cholesterol. They are not water soluble. That means they cannot dissolve in the blood. They are usually encased with a protein or a protein carrier to travel through the blood. But because they are derived from cholesterol, and cholesterol is made up of the lipid membrane or is a component of the lipid membrane, steroid hormones can pass easily through the plasma membrane and into the cell. Again, taking a look at how protein hormones signal a cell here, they cannot pass through the membrane. So again, what do protein hormones do? They bind to receptor molecules in the cell membrane. All right, when that happens, a signal is activated. What happens now is when this protein hormone binds to this specific receptor, it activates this G protein here, which will then activate the specific enzyme to form a secondary messenger. And the secondary messenger here is CAMP, or cyclic AMP, what I call it. And this secondary messenger will then start to make a change inside of the cell. Okay? So again, protein hormones, they bind to a receptor on the lipid membrane, activating a secondary messenger. In this case here, the example is cyclic AMP, which will cause a change inside of the cell. Now what happens? Oh, again, maybe transcription, the promotion or basically the breakdown of glycogen or the formation of glycogen. Again, the opening of ion channels in the membrane. Again, activating specific enzymes here. There's a lot of different things that protein hormones can do, but what I want you to know is the actual mechanism of what happens, or the mechanism of how a protein hormone can actually signal a cell. The example hormone I gave you here is glucagon. Glucagon is a protein hormone, and it helps to break down glycogen inside the cell so the cell can release that glucose into the bloodstream. And this obviously occurs when blood glucose levels are down. Maybe we haven't eaten a meal for quite some time. So again, our blood glucose levels have dropped, again stimulating the production of glucagon. Okay, and that, again, glucagon will activate a cell by telling that cell that it needs to start breaking down glucose and releasing it into the bloodstream. Again, here we have lipid-soluble or steroid hormones, and the mechanism for steroid hormones as they signal a cell, they are different from protein hormones because they can pass through the lipid membrane. Again, they're derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a component of the cellular membrane, so steroid hormones can pass through the membrane. What happens when they pass through the membrane? Well, they bind to a receptor inside of the nucleus here. Okay? They can bind to a receptor inside of the nucleus, activating a complex which then will head into the nucleus to turn on a specific gene or activate transcription. Again, we see activation or inhibition. So steroid hormones can turn genes on or off depending on what's needed at the time. All right, steroid hormones can actually attach to a receptor in the cytoplasm, or steroid hormones can just work their way right through the nucleus and turn on transcription or turn off transcription. And the example I give you here is aldosterone. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone, and what aldosterone does is, in this specific example, is help to increase water retention, okay, or water volume, and by doing that, helping to increase blood pressure. Again, this slide here will be on the test. 3 different ways in which hormones can signal a cell. Okay, we have endocrine, paracrine, or autocrine. So if hormones are activating from an endocrine standpoint, all right, these hormones will be secreted by endocrine glands, travel through the bloodstream, and its target cells are somewhere other than or away from the actual endocrine gland itself. Okay, so these hormones will be activating or signaling cells in another part of the body. We see paracrine. Paracrine act on nearby cells, so they don't travel through the bloodstream. They just act on nearby cells, maybe tissues as well. And then self-regulators, which is autocrine. These are cells that will secrete hormones that will act specifically on themselves. So this will be a test question. You need to know this information. And hormones, they are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. We took a look at feedback loops when we did discuss Chapter 9. Here we see hormones actually, or as an example of a negative feedback mechanism. So once the response has been made, that response will then act negatively on whichever endocrine gland is secreting that hormone. And again, we'll talk about some specific examples here. But hormones work by a negative feedback mechanism. there's two different types of hormones. We see tropic hormones and non-tropic hormones. What's the difference between the two? Tropic hormones, they target endocrine glands. Okay, they target endocrine glands. Non-tropic hormones target cells, tissues, and other organs. So again, the difference between these two hormones is that a tropic hormone will target and activate or signal an endocrine gland. Non-tropic hormones will just target cells or tissues and organs. The hypothalamus, very important here. The hypothalamus is a region of the brain, okay, that is the integrator. We took a look at feedback loops. The hypothalamus is the integrator. Again, it takes in information from from sensory information from the nervous system, and it integrates that information, and the hypothalamus will send out signals. Now, because we're talking about the endocrine system, the hypothalamus can send out a specific hormone that will act on specific endocrine glands, and those endocrine glands will then secrete hormone to stimulate a response or an effect. The hypothalamus produces neurohormones. These neurohormones, again, are responsible for the stimulation or the inhibition of other hormones. And the gland that the hypothalamus actually acts on is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is known as the master gland, but again, the hypothalamus is, if we see here in this region, the hypothalamus will send out these neurohormones to the pituitary gland, which will then obviously start this cascade events of multiple hormones being secreted. Hormones of the hypothalamus, these are hormones that I would like you to know. Again, they are known as releasing hormones. So they are found in the hypothalamus. They will be released depending on what's needed, and they will act specifically on the pituitary gland here, pituitary gland. And these hormones are called releasing hormones. So again, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, okay, somatocin and dopamine. So again, we see these hormones here, they are specifically acting on the pituitary gland, so the pituitary gland can release another type of hormone. So the hypothalamus releases releasing hormone acting on the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will actually release what's known as a stimulating hormone. So if thyroid stimulating hormone needs to be secreted, the hypothalamus will release this thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will act on the pituitary gland, stimulating the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and this is basically, we're now talking about a cascade of events that needs to occur here. And if we were to take a look at this on the picture to the right, we would see thyroid releasing or thyrotropin releasing hormone here in the hypothalamus. That will act specifically on the pituitary gland here. When that happens, or when that occurs, the pituitary gland will release what's known as thyroid stimulating hormone. This thyroid stimulating hormone will then travel down to the thyroid, which is an endocrine gland, and that thyroid will release specific hormones. Okay, we see T4, T3 hormone here. T4, T3 hormone is responsible for our metabolism. So again, it's almost like the game phone, what is it called? Phone call or phone tag, you know, when you whisper something in someone's ear and then they whisper something in someone's ear, and then you go down the line, and next thing you know, you see if you can get the same message from one person to the end of the line there, and there's probably about 30 people there. Well, this is what we see here. This is known as a hormone cascade. Okay, it starts with a releasing hormone. The next is a stimulating hormone released by the pituitary gland. Again, that stimulating hormone will have or will signal a specific endocrine gland. The example we're talking about here is the thyroid gland. That thyroid gland will now release T4 or T3 as a specific type of hormone, and T4, T3 is responsible for thermogenesis and metabolism. Again, we can take a look at other different types of releasing hormones here. Again, the same type of cascade. What I do want you to take a look at, though, is the fact that this thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? And this thyroid stimulating hormone is acting on an endocrine gland. So these hormones will be known as tropic hormones, tropic hormones. These tropic hormones act specifically on endocrine glands. Now, here we see an example of prolactin. Okay, prolactin is released by the pituitary gland as well. Prolactin is responsible for lactation in the female breast. Okay, now we take a look at that. All right, the female breast and the mammary glands here are not endocrine glands. So prolactin, which is again stimulated, or the release of prolactin is stimulated by by dopamine here from the hypothalamus. Again, we see that prolactin will stimulate lactation in the female breast. Again, the female breast is not an endocrine gland, so an example of a non-tropic hormone here would be prolactin. And we could take a look here. We see that these are all of the different types of hormones that the hypothalamus will secrete. And all of these releasing hormones will act on the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland here will release a stimulating hormone. And these stimulating hormones, again, are either your tropic hormones or your non-tropic hormones. Okay? Again, we take a look at the thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, will act on the adrenal cortex, which is found on top of the kidney, to release cortisol. Again, we see growth hormone here. Growth hormone acts specifically on the liver. This is a non-tropic hormone, growth hormone, because it acts on cells throughout the body as well as the liver. Well, the liver will release insulin-like growth factors. Again, we see that our organs will also release specific types of hormones. Okay, they don't function like an endocrine gland, but they can release hormones to produce a response. Again, we see luteinizing hormone here and follicle stimulating hormone. These hormones will act specifically on the gonads, which are the testes and the ovaries found in males and females, respectively. And each of those reproductive organs will secrete specific hormones, androgens. Again, the one that you're probably used to knowing is testosterone. And again, in females, we see estrogens and progesterone. So this here is a cascade event. We start from the hypothalamus, which is our integrator. That integrator will send out a releasing hormone to stimulate the production of a stimulating hormone, which will be released by the pituitary gland. That stimulating hormone will act specifically on an endocrine gland or an organ or nearby cells, so those cells can hopefully receive the signal and begin to start a response, or an endocrine gland which will start to secrete other types of hormones to stimulate another response. And this is the regulatory pathway. Again, this is the negative feedback mechanism that we see for each of those different hormones that we spoke about. The hypothalamus releasing hormone. That releasing hormone will work on the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will release a stimulating hormone. That stimulating hormone will work on a specific gland, an endocrine gland. Again, there are some examples where we see the release of a specific hormone by the pituitary gland, which acts specifically on tissue. And again, the example I gave you was prolactin. But here, this is the regulatory pathway of tropic hormones, not non-tropic hormones. And I will be asking you regulatory pathways of tropic hormones only. Again, we take a look here. The target gland, which is an endocrine gland, will then secrete a specific type of hormone. The example I gave you was thyroid hormone, which was released by the thyroid gland because it was stimulated by the pituitary gland. Now, the release of this hormone by this specific gland here will have a negative feedback mechanism on both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So what's going to happen here is once that hormone is released by the target gland, it will act negatively on the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. It's going to send both of those glands, or specifically speaking the hypothalamus, a message saying that you can stop secreting this releasing hormone because the target gland has been reached or communicated with or signaled that target gland has been able to release that specific hormone, that hormone will act negatively on both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. This will be a test question for sure. I'll give you an example. You'll have to identify specifically what's happening in this cascade of events. Some major features of hormone mechanisms. Again, I would like you to know all 4 of these, but only cells that contain the surface receptors will bind to specific hormones. Again, that being said, here we see this cell for target A. It will not bind with hormone B because it does not have surface receptors. Okay, but once these hormones are bound to their receptors, a response will be made. Okay, so cellular processes will be turned on or off. Okay, so we're basically seeing a cell functioning or not functioning based off of the signals that cell will receive from a hormone. Okay. Hormones are very effective in small concentrations. Okay, an amplification process that occurs here. Cells talk to one another, again, via cell junctions, all right, or cell gaps. All right, now we take a look here. Cells can talk to each other. And when cells talk to each other, when a cell has received a message from a specific hormone, that cell will tell other cells. That's what this amplification process is known as. And again, the response to a hormone will differ among target organs and again among species as well. So we see that different types of hormones will stimulate or inhibit specific responses in our tissues and our organs. Again, and we see this in other species as well. Here we have an example. It's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It's a big word, okay, but when we talk about what's actually happening here and we use what we've just learned in this chapter so far, we can kind of start to make sense of what's happening here. So again, there's stimulus here. What is the stimulus? The stimulus is that the juxtamedullary nephrons are not reabsorbing water. And this could be because blood or water volume is low. And if water volume is low, then we see that there is a decrease in blood pressure. And if there's a decrease in blood pressure, we know that the osmolality, or the amount of solute in our blood, is low as well. So what will the kidneys do here? The kidneys will then secrete a hormone known as renin, or renin. Renin will act specifically on this prohormone here, known as angiotensinogen. Remember, angiotensinogen is a prohormone. Renin acts specifically on this hormone, converting it to its active form. Okay, again, angiotensin goes through a couple processes here. We see a specific enzyme acting on it again to convert it to its final active form. But what does angiotensin do? Angiotensin does a couple things in order for the kidneys to start to reabsorb water. Again, angiotensin will act specifically on the pituitary gland here for ADH secretion. And again, ADH, or vasopressin, specifically acts on the collecting ducts of the nephron so the kidneys can start to reabsorb more water. Not only does angiotensin communicate with the pituitary gland, it also communicates with the arteries. We see vasoconstriction here. Vasoconstriction of the arterial wall, we see that there will be an increase in blood pressure. Again, what we see is the communication of angiotensin with the adrenal gland here, which sits on top of the kidney. And the adrenal gland will then produce and secrete aldosterone. And what does aldosterone do? Again, aldosterone works specifically on the nephron to reabsorb not only water, but also sodium, chloride, and potassium ions. And we see that happening in the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, as well as the distal convoluted tubule. The whole nephron will now start to reabsorb not only ions, but also water as well. And then not only that, our sympathetic system will be activated here, and our sympathetic system will help to respond with organ function. Once this occurs, we see that there will be an increase in blood pressure. And all of those things that we just discussed will have an effect on water and salt retention, so reabsorption of water and sodium ions. Now, when that happens, the juxtamedullary nephron will start to reabsorb more water. When this occurs, we see that there's an increase in water volume, okay, WV, and an increase in blood pressure. When this occurs, this will act negatively on the kidneys And when this occurs, the kidneys will actually stop releasing renin, and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system will be shut down for the time being, unless water reabsorption needs to occur again. So what we see here is a cascade of events. We can pick out the stimulus here. Again, low blood pressure, low blood volume, low water volume, or total body water. And again, we see this secretion of specific enzymes that will act on nearby organs, and we see our whole body working together to help to increase blood pressure. Again, this will probably be a question on your test. I want you to describe how specific enzymes work together, specific hormones work together in order to achieve a goal. And that goal might be increased blood pressure here by this specific renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The pituitary gland. Again, the pituitary gland is acted on by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes these releasing hormones. Again, we see it here. Okay, they travel down into the pituitary gland. Now, again, when this occurs, the pituitary gland will secrete a specific stimulating hormone, and that stimulating hormone can either be a tropic or non-tropic hormone. Again, tropic hormones will stimulate endocrine glands. Non-tropic hormones will stimulate nearby tissues, cells, okay, or organs for a specific response. Again, there's two different lobes, the posterior and anterior lobe here. We'll talk about each of those functions, okay, but this is where we see a link up between the endocrine system and the nervous system. All right, the hypothalamus is a region of the brain, and the pituitary gland is actually a gland that is found that belongs to the endocrine system. So we see the region of a brain here attaching to the pituitary gland. Again, this is where we see neurosecretory cells from the hypothalamus influencing changes or the releasing of hormones by the pituitary gland. This is just a picture of what the pituitary gland looks like. Here we have the anterior pituitary gland and we have the posterior pituitary gland here. These are neurosecretory cells that will stimulate the release of specific hormones by the pituitary gland. And again, taking a look here, the different types of hormones that will be released by the pituitary gland. We see growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Okay, again, endorphins, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormones. Those are the examples of non-tropic hormones. I do want you to take a look at these specific hormones. I do want you to take a look at the hypothalamus and its function in terms of secreting releasing hormone, which acts specifically on the pituitary gland. What we didn't talk about was the posterior pituitary gland actually houses or stores specific hormone that is made by the hypothalamus. For example, ADH. ADH is produced by the hypothalamus, and it will be stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And again, it will be released based off of what is needed in the actual body at that specific time. I do want you to review the different types of feedback mechanisms. I will ask you guys questions about feedback mechanisms on the test, and I will have you guys identify the specific elements that belong in a negative feedback mechanism. For instance, the stimulus, the sensor, the integrator, the effect, the response. Again, you need to include the negative feedback mechanism. Once a target gland secretes hormone, it will act negatively both on the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And you really need to include that in your negative feedback mechanisms. Please review this as many times as possible, and again, take your own notes.